Hi, we're back with the COVID Sense series. This is a series of videos that tackles the data behind a lot of what we see and hear about COVID. In this September update, we'll update you on a number of aspects of COVID, including testing, natural immunity, and vaccine safety and efficacy. So, where are we right now? Well, in Ontario, um, the vaccination machine is moving forward at full throttle. We have almost 85% of the population having received at least one dose of the vaccine, and about 80% of the population being fully vaccinated as of September 18th. A lot of this vaccination push is now coming in the form of a vaccine passport, which will basically allow people to circulate in public spaces, whether based on their vaccination status, as well as vaccine mandates that are being implemented at both the federal level and through various businesses and university settings. So, what else do we know? We know that the vaccines, Pfizer and Moderna, have been fully approved by Health Canada, and that there is a new Moderna plant, which is being welcomed here in Canada, in Ontario specifically. So, by all appearances, it would seem as though vaccination is going to be a part of our new normal. So, if that's the case, what we really need to know is that they're actually delivering on what they promised, which is to be safe and effective. So, we're going to cover off a lot of that in this particular presentation. So, we should begin our discussion with risk of severe disease. So, this is a plot that looks at COVID related events, cases, hospitalization, ICU, or deaths from March 2020 to February 2021. And it looks at it per age group. And the first thing that we want to consider are these dots here. There are some that around 20,000 people in this age group, and in this age group have had COVID and recovered. So that these numbers are the number of reported cases then adjusted for seroprevalence, which means testing for antibodies in the broader population, because the number of cases that are reported are always lower than the actual people who got it because not everybody has been tested. So we can see that across the board, a lot of people have got COVID and recovered from it. And you can see that that's 22,000 out of every 100,000 people. So that's quite prevalent, and that was in February 2021 for a full year. If we look at things that are indicators of severe disease, hospitalization, ICU, and death, you can see that they're very low, all of them, right through to the end of 59. There's a little bit more, 60, 69, a little bit more, 70, 79, and then greater at 80. And this is the really concerning age group, is people who are over 80. And things to consider when we're looking at high rates like this are that these people are old and they have comorbid conditions, and many of them are already dying. And so sometimes COVID comes along and it may take 6 months or a year off of their life. But generally speaking, they would have died of something else if they hadn't died of COVID, or they may be dying of something else and happened to catch COVID at the time. So that's one of the things that we really need to be distinguished of, is not all these deaths were from COVID, but they could have been dying with COVID. Just on the way that we count cases, hospitalizations, and death or COVID events. Another thing to really remember is that 81% of all of the deaths in Canada were in long-term care facilities. And the reason why that makes sense is because the people in long-term care facilities, as we mentioned before, are older, have comorbid conditions, and they are in shared living situations, which allows the virus, which is spread via aerosols, to circulate among those residing in the long-term care facility together. And therefore, the people who catch COVID, they basically are both at high risk of exposure to COVID and also high risk of severe disease. Now, if you look at the other part of the population, those who aren't living in long-term care facilities, which are the majority of the population, who are young and have strong innate immune systems, you can see that the rate of disease is very low. And those that are experiencing disease probably do have some other condition, like they're immunocompromised, they have comorbid conditions, or there's something else that's going on. The other thing that we need to remember is, because treatment hadn't been fully established and isn't something that's done regularly, these numbers reflect no treatment rather than treatment. So we would know that the numbers would look a lot better if these people had been treated properly. And we'll talk about treatment in a little bit in the next slide or two. So another thing that we need to be thinking about when we're looking at our cases at the beginning of the pandemic, we started using the PCR test in order to diagnose COVID. And it was assumed that when you had a positive PCR test that you had a COVID infection, an active infection, and therefore could spread the disease, and you had to quarantine and all that business, nothing new. However, we've learned a lot more about the PCR test. And what we've done is we've done something called we've clinically validated. It means that you actually compare it to people who are actually have active infections to see how many of the tests actually reflect people with who are actually infected versus not. And when they did that, what they found was that the majority of people, which were all these little dots, basically were not infectious. And what was being detected by the PCR test was genetic fragments or genetic material from prior infections. And so it wasn't able to distinguish whenever cycled at very high thresholds, so between 30 and 40, people who had prior infections, which are these guys, from people who had active infections, which are these guys. So one of the things that we need to remember when we hear reports of cases of COVID, we really don't know if these are people who've recovered, who have active infections. It's very difficult to tell, but we know that the majority of them don't reflect infection. And so that's really something to remember. And even today, regardless of whether we know this about it, we continue to use the PCR test, and we continue to test at cycle thresholds between 30 and 40. You can see here that this is the Ontario guidance, which tests anywhere between 23.8 to 45. So let's talk about natural immunity. Natural immunity has had a hard rap. A lot of people think that natural immunity is insufficient and that they need vaccine-induced immunity, and a lot of our policies seem to reflect this thought. However, there's a number of papers that have come out now. I've identified a couple of them here in the references. The first one was by Gazet et al., and it looked at 600,000 people who had some sort of immunity, whether it was vaccine-induced or natural. And what they found was that those who had vaccine-induced immunity had a greater risk of infection, symptomatic infection, and COVID-19 related hospitalization compared to those with natural immunity. And it became particularly so when they looked at the Delta variant. In terms of T-cell mediated immunity, they looked at the study by Lebert, looked at T-cell immunity that was caused or induced by SARS, and we found out that it lasted 18 years since the 2003, and that those T-cells that were caused by SARS infections basically were cross-reactive to the SARS-CoV-2. So immunity that is even acquired as long as 18 years ago can still have a benefit today whenever it comes to natural immunity. So I think that this is really important to remember. If you're COVID recovered, even if they recommend that you get vaccination, there's no proof that getting a vaccine is going to cause any greater amount of protection compared to natural immunity. Let's talk about treatment. So the FLCC, which is the Frontline COVID-19 Critical Care Alliance, is a fantastic organization. And what they've done is they've actually mapped out the phases of disease. And what you can see here is that in the initial phase, you have viral replication. Incubation is where you're non-symptomatic or you're asymptomatic, and then you become symptomatic here. And then it moves into this phase where you have viral debris, and that affects your pulmonary phase. It's the early pulmonary phase. And then you have delayed innate immunity. And here, sometimes the virus causes dysregulation of your immune system, which can cause organ damage and pulmonary damage. And this is where you kind of get the severe disease. So what this group has done is it's basically developed a protocol where you're using different drugs at different times based on the phase. And when you use this multi-drug approach, they've had great success in stopping COVID and minimizing severe disease and death. So I highly recommend that you go and check out the FLCCC and you look at their prevention and early treatment protocols. so that you have things that are on hand just in case you do get infected with SARS-CoV-2. Well, that's all that we have for today. Thank you very much for listening to this series of videos on the September update. We really strive to provide you with a solid evidence in everyday language. So if you like what we're doing, please share our videos, subscribe to our channel, and you can also follow us on Rumble, Twitter, and send us an email. I'll have all of that contact information in the notes section.